Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this morning we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddhas. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse, give some explanation, and I'll take any questions at the end. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So we'll be looking at the Sanidāna Sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 14, sutta number 12. So this is a short discourse on a bit about how states of mind arise. So I'll talk, again I'll start reading through the suttas and talk about its meaning as we go through, and feel free to type in questions at any time. So the sutta begins, and I'm reading here from Bhante Sujato's translation, but I'll be making some comments on the translation as well as we go along. The sutta begins, At Savatthi. Mendicants, sensual, malicious, and cruel thoughts arise for a reason, not without reason. And what's translated here as a reason in Pali is nidana. So nidana means the origin of something, the source for something. So it's saying that there's a source, there's an origin for sensual, malicious, and cruel thoughts. So they don't just arise randomly or spontaneously, but there's something that has to have been previously present in order for these things to arise. So this is already pointing at one of the critical underlying concepts of Buddhism, of Buddhist thought, which is that everything is causal. Everything has a causal basis. Nothing is completely random or spontaneous, but rather everything has a pre-existing cause or condition which makes it possible for it to happen. So the Buddha continues, he says, and how do sensual, malicious, and cruel thoughts arise for a reason, or arise from a cause, or arise with an origin, causal basis, not without reason? The Buddha says, the element of sensuality gives rise to sensual perceptions. Sensual perceptions give rise to sensual thoughts. Sensual thoughts give rise to sensual desires. Sensual desires give rise to sensual passions. Sensual passions give rise to searches for sensual pleasures. And I want to talk a little bit about a few of the terms that the Buddha is using here. So first off, he says kama dhatu is the conditional basis for the arising of kama sanya. So dhatu means the foundation. Translated here as element, which is the most common translation of the word dhatu. So kama dhatu means the aspect of sensuality. So this can be either external or internal. So the sensuality is a fundamental aspect of reality as part of samsara. So in that sense, it's a dhatu, in that it's a irremovable, basic aspect of samsara, of the unenlightened experience. And it's also something that's in our own mind. So all unenlightened beings have a basic tendency toward sensuality. It's also an aspect of all of the lower 10 realms of existence. So the Buddha spoke about 30 realms of existence, and the first 10 are called the Kama Loka, the world of sensuality. And right in the middle of that is the human realm. So our experience is characterized by sensuality, by a certain fixation with seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, a basic fixation with physical sensory experience. So with that immersion in physical sensuality, the sensory experience of having a physical body and relating to physical sensations, then there arises sensual perception, so kama sanya, which means we're seeing the world and relating to the world in terms of sensuality, in terms of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and in particular in terms of the pursuit for pleasant sensual experiences. Nice food, nice fragrances, pleasant things to touch. So we're always looking for particularly pleasant sensory experiences. And also we're of course trying to avoid painful sensory experiences. So always relating to our experience of the world in terms of what brings sensual pleasure and reduces sensual pain. So then kamasanya, the perception of sensuality, it then also means that we're constantly identifying and evaluating our experiences based upon what increases our sensual pleasure and reduces our sensual pain. So rather than evaluating things based on, for example, what leads to an increase in wholesome states of mind or what leads to a development in spiritual qualities, instead we're normally relating to the world in terms of what will increase our sensual pleasure. So we're perceiving the world in terms of sources of sensual pleasure. Simple example of this actually is if you come to buffet line, so there's a lot of different varieties of food laid out on a table and you can pick whatever you want. What does the mind prioritize? And what does the mind place value on? So is the mind, do you notice that you tend to perceive the food in terms of, oh, this has such and such nutritional value and that has those nutrients which would be useful for me, and those foods have that those medical qualities which could be helpful for my current health conditions, or so that would be a wise way of relating to food. Or do we start thinking like, oh, that looks really delicious, oh, that looks sweet, oh, I like that looks like it will have a good texture, and that looks like it will be fun to eat. So that would be a sensual perception. So are we perceiving food as medicine and fuel to sustain our physical health, or are we perceiving food as a variety of ways of experiencing sensual pleasure? So this right here is the function of sanya. Sanya is how we relate to our sensory experiences. So are we relating to the perception of food? Are we perceiving food in terms of its functional qualities, its functional qualities of supporting our health, or are we relating to it in terms of its sensual qualities, in terms of what kind of pleasant sensory experiences it can produce through our body? So then the next phrase is kamasanya. So based on this kamasanya, this perceiving the world, relating to things in terms of sensuality. Then there comes kama sankappa. So sankappa, it's translated here as thought. It also has the meaning of intentions or attitudes. So when we start seeing the world in terms of sensuality, so relating to all of our experiences in terms of what will produce sensual pleasure and what will help us reduce painful sensory experiences. So relating to the world as our playground. Relating to the world as our pleasure buffet. Then what happens is that then we're constantly forming attitudes and intentions based upon sensuality. So our attitude is about relating to the world in terms of a source of pleasure, a source of sensual pleasure. And our intentions then tend to be based upon the intention to pursue pleasure, to pursue more sensual gratification. And yes, that also can lead to thought, to constantly ruminating about sensuality, constantly strategizing about sensuality. Like, how can I get more sensual pleasure in my life? How can I avoid sensual pain or displeasure? And then based upon kama sankappa, then we have kama chanda. So chanda means enthusiasm or interest. So then we have enthusiasm for sensuality, interest in sensuality. So the mind starts to become increasingly fixated and obsessed with sensuality. And from that it says kama chanda. From kama chanda there comes kama parilaha. And the word parilaha literally means fever. The prefix pari means completely or thoroughly, and laha means burning. So parilaha literally means completely burning. So kama parilaha means our mind is completely burning with sensuality. Very much like the expression burning with desire. Like we say, oh, I have a burning desire for cookies, or I'm burning with desire for so-and-so. So this is kama parilaha. It's when the mind is completely on fire with sensuality. It's completely consumed and obsessed with sensuality. And the Buddha often used fire to indicate a state of painful agitation. So that's also pointing to what happens when the mind is completely obsessed with sensuality. It's like the mind is literally on fire, and not in a good way, but rather in the sense of a painful, agitated, disturbing burning, like the mind is burning from the inside out. So, and when the mind has that obsessive burning for sensuality, then what happens? Well, then the Buddha says, based upon kama parilaha, then there is kama pariyesana. And kama pariyesana means searching, seeking. So then we're constantly seeking sensuality, hunting for sensuality. So with this mind that's on fire, burning with desire for sensuality, then we're constantly seeking it, constantly pursuing sensuality. And the Buddha says, an unlearned ordinary person, an uneducated commoner, so an asuttava patujana, so the ordinary unenlightened person who has not heard the Dhamma, he says, an unlearned ordinary person on a search for sensual pleasure behaves badly in 3 ways, by body, speech, and mind. So, in other words, when we're consumed with sensuality, obsessed with sensuality, seeking sensuality, then that becomes our priority. It becomes our central value. And with sensuality as our primary value, above all else, then morality becomes irrelevant. In fact, morality can start to be viewed as an obstacle because it prevents us from getting the maximum amount of sensual pleasure out of our life. So then if one values sensual pleasure more than morality, then naturally one will start to do misconduct. One will start to engage in inappropriate behavior, possibly even blatantly evil behavior, in order to strategize to get the maximum amount of sensual pleasure, no matter what harm we're causing to others or ourselves along the way. And next, so the Buddha then talks about the second form of unwholesome thoughts here. So he talks about malice, which in Pali is bhyapada. Bhyapada, more commonly we translate as aversion. Translating it as malice is a little bit strong, because bhyapada has a more general sense. It's not just about the most extreme malicious states of mind, but rather it's about any kind of aversion or hostility or negativity towards any kind of experience. So even something like you're feeling a little bit achy this morning and you're kind of like, my body hurts. And there's just that element of aversion of like, oh, I wish my body didn't feel like this. This is kind of annoying. Or you go to have a cup of tea and it's just not quite hot enough, and you're just like, ugh, the tea's cold. And the mind's a little bit aversive, it's a little bit annoyed by the experience. So Vyapada can also refer to more mild states of aversion. It's not necessarily malice in the sense of like, I hate everything and I want to destroy it. It can just be that little bit of like, this kind of sucks, I don't like this. So that more subtle kind of disliking, negativity. So again, from the element of Vyapada, of aversion, this basic aspect of aversiveness is a underlying tendency of mind. Then there arises aversive perceptions. So we start looking at the world in terms of things to hate or things to be annoyed by. We start looking for excuses to be annoyed. We start looking for things to dislike, things to nitpick about. And based upon Vyapada Sanya, so aversive perceptions, then there's Vyapada Sankappa. So again, aversive attitudes and intentions and thoughts. So then we have this tendency to always look at the dark side of things, the negative side of things, the unpleasant side of things, constantly fueling and feeding that negative attitude. And Vyapada Chanda, so this interest or enthusiasm for aversion. And actually what often starts to happen is the more we look at the world in a aversive, negative way, the more we build up a self-identity around that. The more we start to get attached to the experience of being an aversive person. So we start to actually get enthusiastic about our own aversion. It's just like, oh yeah, I hate that. Yeah. Like you can actually build a certain sick pleasure in being hostile and negative towards things, and being aversive and grumpy and irritable about things. There's a certain sickly pleasure in being aversive. And then the mind becomes increasingly obsessed with hating things and being aversive and negative about things. And this leads to the final step, which is Vyapada Pariyesana, so the search, the aversive search. So constantly searching for things to be aversive towards. So constantly seeking out things in our experience to be negative about or hostile about. So then it's just constantly fueling this aversive tendency of mind. And the Buddha says that when the asuttava patujana, the unawakened ordinary person who doesn't know the Dhamma, when they're engaging in this aversive search, then they engage in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. So, and again, this is quite easy to understand. When we're consumed with aversion, when the mind is constantly fixated in this negative attitude of looking for things to hate on, things to be annoyed by, things to be hostile towards, then that naturally leads to us acting and speaking in hostile ways. It can even lead to us engaging in acts of violence towards others or even towards ourselves. So we can see how then that this building up of aversive patterns of mind can then lead to unwholesome and even evil behaviors with our body and speech as well. And then the third one, so the third one is vihingsa. So the Buddha gives the same sequence, but here with vihingsa. And vihingsa means cruelty, or harming. So harmfulness. This is much more clearly about deliberately wanting to hurt or harm or inflict pain or inflict suffering on sentient beings. So either on others or on ourselves. And we see the same sequence. So from the element of cruelty, there's cruel perceptions of cruelty. And vihingsa sankappa, so attitudes, intentions, thoughts that are cruel or based on cruelty. Vihingsa chanda, so this interest or enthusiasm about cruelty. So getting really excited and zealous about inflicting harm and suffering on sentient beings. Vihingsa parilaho, so this fervent obsession with cruelty. So one can even get to a point where they're addicted to cruelty. They just love inflicting suffering on people. So the sadistic attitude of wanting to find ways to make beings suffer, delighting in causing suffering. And the search for ways to cause harm. So vihingsa parayesana, constantly seeking out ways to inflict harm, to inflict suffering and misery. And of course, naturally, that leads to evil behaviors with body and speech as well. So when the mind is completely obsessed and fixated on harming and seeking ways to cause harm, then naturally that leads to us actually causing harm. And the Buddha gives a metaphor. He says, suppose a person was to drop a burning torch in a thicket of dry grass. If they don't quickly extinguish it with their hands and feet, the creatures living in the grass and wood would come to ruin. So you could actually start a forest fire. Our friends who live in California have had many problems with forest fires over the years. So it can start very simply. You light a little campfire and you don't carefully extinguish it when you're done, and it can wind up incinerating hundreds of thousands of forest, killing huge amounts of sentient beings, causing incredible pain and suffering. So in the same way, if we don't quickly stamp out these sensual tendencies, aversive tendencies, and malicious, harmful tendencies in the mind, then they can very easily spread. So just like a fire is spreading through a dry forest, in the same way, these unwholesome attitudes of mind can quickly spread through the mind, consume our mind, and lead to us causing incredible harm and suffering to the people around us as well. So the Buddha says, in the same way, a corrupt perception might arise in a contemplative or a Brahmin. If they don't quickly give it up, get rid of it, eliminate it, and obliterate it, they'll suffer in the present life with distress, anguish, and fever. And when they're separated from their body after death, they can expect to be reborn in a bad place. So here the Buddha is emphasizing that when we indulge in sensual, aversive, or cruel tendencies of mind, then that makes us suffer. So it's not just harmful to the people around us, it makes ourselves suffer. And it also creates the kind of evil karma, bad karma, that leads to a painful and unpleasant rebirth in the future. So we want to be extremely careful, recognizing that whenever we find ourselves playing with sensual attitudes and aversive attitudes and especially cruel attitudes, then this is like playing with fire in a dry forest. If we're not really careful, then we're just going to wind up burning ourselves and burning a lot of other people as well. And the best thing to do, actually, is to extinguish the fire. Put it out as soon as we can, so that it never gets a chance to get out of control. And then on the positive side, the Buddha says, thoughts of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness arise for a reason, not without a reason. So again, Sanidāna. There's an origin, there's a basis, there's a cause for the mind being to think about renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. So renunciation here is nekkhamma. So putting things down, relinquishing, letting go. The attitude of contentment. And what's translated as goodwill is abhyapada, so non-aversion. So not being aversive or negative about things. And harmlessness is avihingsa, so non-harm, non-cruelty. Not wishing to see others suffer, not wishing to cause suffering. And notice here that here the word that's translated as thought is vitakka, which is different from sankappa. So vitakka is more about verbal thoughts, discursive thoughts, whereas sankappa is more about attitude or intention. So there's a basis for the arising of thoughts of renunciation, non-aversion, and non-cruelty. And how does this happen, the Buddha says? So the first one, he says, the element of renunciation gives rise to perceptions of renunciation. So in other words, when we have this underlying tendency towards renunciation, towards contentment, then we start to look at the world in that way. We start to see things in the world as opportunities to practice contentment, opportunities to let things go. We start to see what we're relating to in the world as something not to be clung to, not to be craved, not to be attached to, but rather things to relinquish, to let go of, to allow them to come and go as is their nature. And that gives rise to the attitude of renunciation, which nekkhamma sankappa is the second part of the Eightfold Path. So samma sankappa includes nekkhamma sankappa. So the attitude of renunciation, the attitude of contentment and letting go, non-attachment. And that then gives rise to enthusiasm for renunciation, nekkhamma chanda. This interest and enthusiasm and zeal for renunciation, this appreciation for renunciation. And this is because renunciation is actually a very calm, pleasant, joyful state of mind. So renunciation doesn't mean you're losing anything important. It actually means that you're gaining peace and joy, an unshakable serenity and joyfulness of mind. So you can get enthusiastic about that, enthusiastic about having a mind which is always peaceful and happy. And enthusiasm for renunciation gives rise to fervor for renunciation. So the more we practice renunciation, the more we start to really appreciate that serene, peaceful joy of contentment, of non-attachment. And the more we appreciate that, the more the mind becomes obsessed with it. And this is a form of healthy obsession, because it's obsessing with something which is completely blameless, and which only inclines the mind towards ever-increasing purity and goodness. And he says, the fervor for renunciation gives rise to the search for renunciation. So then we're constantly seeking opportunities for renunciation. We're constantly looking for ways of living a more renunciant life. And of course, the most complete manifestation of this is becoming a monastic. So here at the monastery, a couple of days ago, we had an ordination. So actually 2 ordinations, so an ordination of a bhikkhu and a bhikkhuni. So this is the fullest and deepest manifestation of the search for renunciation, is when one chooses to enter into the renunciant path, the renunciant life, the life of the renunciant contemplative. But also for lay people, it's looking at our life and looking to see, where am I attached, where am I obsessed, and how can I start letting go of my attachments and obsessions? How can I start cultivating an attitude of contentment and non-attachment? And as we find that, then the Buddha says, he says, the learned disciple of the noble ones, on the search for renunciation, behaves well in 3 ways, by body, speech, and mind. In other words, when we're constantly seeking renunciation, based upon an understanding of the Dhamma, an appreciation of awakened beings, a respect for enlightened beings, then that naturally leads to us taking on principles of morality, and naturally leads to us engaging in harmless behaviors. It naturally leads to us engaging in good principles of morality. And he gives a similar analysis for avyapada, so non-aversion. So based on the element of non-aversion, so this basic underlying tendency in the mind towards not being aversive, then we start to see the world in that way. We start to see the world as something which is not to be hated, not to be irritated by. But we start to see the world as just being a natural expression of the way things are. Not something which is worth being aversive towards, because fundamentally there's actually nothing wrong. It's completely natural. Like there's no point in going outside and getting angry at the rain. That's just what nature does. It rains once in a while. There's no point in being annoyed by the leaves falling in autumn. That's just what leaves do. So we start to recognize, oh, this is just the way the world is. And there's no point in being aversive about it, because it's just expressing its basic nature. So we start to see the world as something which is not worth being aversive towards, and then the mind starts developing the attitude of non-aversion. So avyapada sankappa, again part of the Eightfold Path. The attitude of non-aversion, of not wanting to be negative or hostile towards anything in our experience. And we start to get enthusiastic about that, because we start to recognize that non-aversion is actually a very pleasant and peaceful state of mind. Especially for those of us who are prone towards aversion, who have a tendency towards being irritated or annoyed by things. When we start to settle the mind in non-aversion, you start to see, oh, this is actually a much more pleasant state of mind. It's much more pleasant than being annoyed by things. It's much more pleasant than being negative about things. It's actually much more pleasant to have a peaceful state of mind rather than an aversive state of mind. And so then we have the fervor, this enthusiasm, this obsession with having a non-aversive mind. And we start seeking for how we can have less aversion, a mind which is free of aversion and negativity. And of course, the Buddha says that when we're seeking non-aversion, then naturally we'll engage in good behavior by body, speech, and mind. Naturally we'll be inclined towards good moral conduct, because we don't want to be aversive or negative towards anyone or anything. And of course, the same applies to the third example of good mental thoughts and attitudes, which is harmlessness, non-harming, avihingsa. So again, we start to cultivate this harmlessness, this attitude of not wanting to cause pain or suffering to anyone. We start building and cultivating and appreciating that attitude of harmlessness. And again, that naturally leads to us actively seeking for ways to be harmless, ways to avoid causing harm to any sentient being. And so again, the Buddha gives the simile. He says, suppose a person was to drop a burning torch in a thicket of dry grass. If they were to quickly extinguish it with their hands and feet, the creatures living in the grass and the wood would not come to ruin. In the same way, a corrupt perception might arise in a contemplative or Brahmin. And here I actually really appreciate the Buddha's honesty here. So he's saying, like, yeah, even the best spiritual practitioner, from time to time we might see unwholesome, harmful, corrupt attitudes appearing in the mind. That's normal. Anyone who's not fully enlightened will still occasionally have unwholesome tendencies appearing in the mind. That's normal. What's important is what we do about it. And so the Buddha says, if they quickly give it up, get rid of it, eliminate it, and obliterate it, then they will be happy in the present life, free of distress, anguish, and fever. And when they're separated from the body after death, they can expect to be reborn in a good place. So again, it's normal to have unwholesome attitudes appearing in the mind every now and then, but the good spiritual practice is to recognize those unwholesome tendencies, see them as harmful, and to actively work to eliminate them immediately, to revert the mind to a state of wholesomeness. And in this way, the mind becomes increasingly pure, and we progress towards, at a minimum, towards a happier life here and now, followed by a good rebirth. And at best, it actually cultivates the conditions that lead to full awakening, freedom from the whole cycle of suffering. So that's the end of the discourse. At this time we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Jayanta, Manal, Gita, Bhumika, Karuna, Christina, Saw, Scott, Fodizi, Maria, Marielle, and Victor. Good to see all of you. And Karuna says, would discontent be strong enough for Vyapada? The other DPD renderings are quite strong. Dislike, ill will, hatred, hostility, enmity, malevolence. Discontent I don't quite like for Vyapada. I'm a little aversive towards discontent as a translation for Vyapada. Discontent more readily fits for words like arati. So rati means to like something or approve of something. So arati means disliking, disapproval. So that has a more clear sense of discontent. The word content in Pali, for contentment, I tend to think of words like santuti, from which we get the name santusika, for example. It means contented. Also where we get the word tusita. The tusita heaven is the heaven of the contented devas. So that's more where I would put the word discontent. For Vyapada, I actually really think aversion is a really good translation. I think it really pins it down quite nicely. Or negativity, in the sense of having a negative attitude towards something. Dislike is okay. Ill will is okay. Hatred is too strong. Hostility is okay. Enmity I'm not a huge fan of. Malevolence again is a little too strong. I really like aversion. Aversion, negativity, hostility. I think those are the best of the ones that you've mentioned here. And we have another question here. So Christina says, how does yoniso manasikara work during the elimination of unwholesome thoughts? Well, yoniso manasikara, so yoniso literally means based on origin or causality. So yoni means womb. So yoniso means based upon the womb, based upon the origin or the source. Based on an understanding of causality. And manasikara, manasi means mental, in the mind, and kara means activity or doing. So yoniso manasikara means mental activity based on an understanding of causality, based on a wise understanding of cause and condition, cause and effect. So the way it works in the elimination of unwholesome thoughts is that when an unwholesome thought arises, we recognize that if we engage in that unwholesome thought, if we participate in it, if we fuel it, if we maintain it, then that will cause more suffering and confusion and foolishness in the future. That will build up the condition for us to have an increasingly corrupt and uncontrollable mind. So yoniso manasikara then is then making actions with the mind which will reduce those unwholesome tendencies. Because we recognize that this is the cause which leads to an increasingly pure and joyful and blameless mind. So that's how yoniso manasikara works here. And that looks like the last question. So if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and conclude at this time. So we'll end with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. and we'll see you next time.